Okay, we are live back in the Fireside PM podcast with my good friend and classmate David Hyman. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Happy to be here.
We just had a nice dinner a week ago, a little over a week ago, I guess. And we were both at our uh, Harvard Business School 20-year reunion. And I so much enjoyed our dinner conversation. Oh, speaking of class of 2003, we have Pam Persky in the house. Hey, Pam.
Hey, Tom. Hey, David. How are you?
Hey there.
We are great. We were just talking about how our reunion sparked a lot of really fun kind of reflection conversations, and I thought it would be fun to do a podcast where we just discuss. Why don't we start with a little bit of introductions about each of you, and then we'll get into like I think I'd love to talk about. Hey, were there any sessions that were really resonated with you because we had so many interesting faculty lectures and things? And then were there any conversations? And then we could talk also, time permitting, to just zoom out 20 years out of B school, any reflections in general. But why don't we start in the order that we joined? David, a little introduction for the audience to get to know you better.
So classmates with Tom and Pam, and I've got a couple of kids. So when I think of every reunion in the last 20 years in particular, I think a lot about them because that's where life has changed the most. In fact, our son was born right between finals and graduation walk. Faith was pregnant in her second year in EC, so we keep the clock current by watching him. And I've got two wonderful daughters as well, Abigail, who is in high school, and Grace, who's still in elementary school. And then for work, I travel a whole lot. I get to work in the electric power and energy space, a lot of energy transition stuff these days. So that's kind of my background.
Well, welcome, David. Let's go to Pam and Rahul. We're doing intros, so we'll go to Pam and then to you.
Hey, Rahul. Hi,
Hey,
hi,
Pam. Hey,
everyone.
guys.
Yeah, we were all in the same section together, so it's nice to continue with our reunion after the reunion.
The post reunion.
The post reunion. Yeah, so I also graduated 20 years ago from HBS, and I now live in New Jersey with my husband, who I was dating at the time, engaged to second year, and then our two girls who are 12 and 15, so they're keeping us busy. And since the last reunion 5 years ago, I actually started a wealth management family office business. So that's been exciting, busy, my third child. But yeah, no, everything has been great. It's so nice to catch up with everyone at reunion. And Rahul keeps us together in New York, so that's nice between the reunion dates.
It is crazy
Thanks
what
for the
Rahul
shout
does
out.
for the school. Yes, Rahul, tell us about yourself.
Rahul Mehendale again, part of the big sexy group for people who don't know what sexy means. That's Section C. Before you get your brains going in all weird directions, but that too. Uh, so I'm a little bit of a recovering entrepreneur and a disruption bigot. So I've done three startups. My last one was the first one in the world where we had figured out how to quantify skin health. So skin, which is our largest organ, didn't have metrics which would help us define the health of the organ. So founded that, ran that for 12 years, got a large strategic investment from a $19 billion German company called Evonik, after which I decided to transition out. Um, Currently, I'm a managing director at Deloitte. I lead the future of health efforts around new businesses. So all topics which are related to over the horizon plays in the health landscape across both payers as well as providers and life sciences. I typically play in. So things like research platforms, which Tom and I have spoken about, um, things like AR, VR applications, or things around wellness and well-being, and if there's an opportunity in that space to make to enhance outcomes for patients and consumers. So those are kind of the topics I typically play in. On the personal side, I I'm a fairly social guy, as these guys have already alluded to. So I love people. That gives me a high. And got two daughters, almost the same age as Pam's, so 15 and 11 now. And they're both competitive swimmers. That's why I'm trying to shuttle between swim meets today and being at home. So great to be here.
Yeah, well, welcome, Rahul. And I know you may have to jump a little early, but appreciate you coming on to join us for the start. My background, also fellow classmate to this amazing group, currently in product management at Google, in applied research, and host of this little product management podcast. But we're going to zoom out and we'll talk about leadership and business in general. Maybe we'll start off with we had this kind of embarrassment of riches when we were back in Boston last week with all these amazing faculty-led lectures and sessions. I'm curious if there were any that kind of still stuck with you a week later. And, anyone can go first, but I'm sure we all have one or two that we want to talk about. It could be the same one, but who wants to go first?
I'll jump in and I'll tell you, we had a special cameo appearance that almost overshadowed. So the professor did this interesting talk about identifying and predicting around bubbles, market bubbles, and talked a lot about the research that the team had done. And that was actually very interesting. And one of the audience members was asking Q&A and said, is this investable? And as the professor was starting to answer, he took input from the crowd because in the back had walked Ray Dalio. It was Ray's 50th reunion. And so Ray started talking about how what he looks for to see what's going to pop a bubble, some of the limits around how much money a bank can put in or whether a particular business model needs capital market access. It was fascinating. And so I think the professor, Professor Greenwood, did a wonderful job, and it was very interesting talk. But I have to say that I think one of the highlights, the unexpected benefits, was seeing other classmates, and in this particular instance, somebody who has really got an amazing track record in the space. So it was a lot of fun to hear Ray talk and do a little banter back and forth with the professor and with others in the audience.
So are we in a bubble, or what did Ray say?
Yeah, so according to this professor's set of metrics, technically it was not showing as bubble. Mm-hmm. And that I think was part of the back and forth with the audience. And so he had defined it down to specific industry sets that had been up 100% in the last 2 years. And it was interesting because there are a lot of those situations where things continue to go up. And there are, of course, other situations where things roll back over. And so they're looking for features that they could use to actually predict which one you were in. Are you in one that's going to roll over? Are you one that's going to keep going? It was less conclusive than I would have wished. And I think that's why the audience was looking for investability discussion points. And that's where Ray brought up the concept of limits. So he clearly...
So David, I was actually standing next to Ray Dalio, and the best part of the class was I followed Ray Dalio out, and we had a one-on-one. So
I'm sure you did, Rahul. What did you?
The ultimate networker.
Yeah, what was your combo with Ray like?
So I had a really interesting discussion with him. So I asked him, his perspective on what to watch out for. So he also laid out a similar thought process. He said, well, if you look at credit markets, they are okay. If you look at business credit, real estate, all those aspects are okay. But what he said was really disturbing is government debt. And then he laid out a really interesting thought process where he said the challenges with government debt is basically, in his view, is completely toxic. And he said that it's not mark to market. And a bunch of our classmates asked me what mark to market for government debt means. So basically, as interest rates go up, if some debt is issued at, let's say, $100 face value, as the interest rates go up, that same debt is now selling for, let's say, $80, right? But the government debt doesn't get marked down to $80. It still stays on the books as $100. So this creates an imbalance in government debt. If this were a corporate situation, then they would have had to liquidate assets to make up for the loss in face value or loss in asset price. So that doesn't happen with the government. And so his perspective was that the only way out was for the government to print more money. And he said that this is not going to end well. So the other question I asked him, I was like, okay, so are you saying that this is only given that we just raised the debt limit, we're printing more and more money? I said, is this just a U.S. specific problem, and is global, are there local global economies which may be better off? And he said, no. He said every government almost is insolvent. And I was like, wow, that's a pretty stark perspective. So I asked him, I said, okay, what's the end game, and what would you recommend? Because just like David, I mean, I was in that Greenwood class, and I was like, so are we in a bubble or are we not? Like, nothing. It wasn't very conclusive, right? So I was like, Ray, what's the end game? So he says it was interesting. I mean, he didn't directly say that I will invest here, right? But he said he kind of alluded to. He said gold. We talked about gold. We talked about real estate. We talked about lumber. We talked about water. So those were some of the themes that he laid out, which was incredibly helpful for me. And
Wow.
I didn't know this, but there was another question. So would the government actually stop the purchasing of gold? And one would think, how in the world would that happen? Well, there's actually a precedent in the US. So I think in 1929 or sometime, the government actually stopped people from purchasing gold because it was in a similar situation. So, it was a very learning exercise, which is outside of the class. But, coming back, Tom, to your question, from a class perspective, actually, I thought Leslie Perlow's, when she showed her insights, were pretty amazing. So she talked about crafting your life, and specifically, I think being able to see how happiness goes up as we get older. I think that was really interesting to see, and I was most surprised to see that happiness actually went up as people had more and more kids. So I was like, wow. That was not something that being a father of two kids. I was like, man, that must be that may
be
be
another
more
family.
stressful and decrease happiness. But I took
Actually,
wow.
interestingly, I was going to mention the one that really stuck with me was Arthur Brooks's lecture. I don't know if anyone went to that. It was so good. But he showed the chart. So maybe this aligns long term with children make you happier. But he was showing a chart where basically when you graduate from HBS, maybe you're around 28 or so, people think that their happiness will be increasing at the reunions 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. But actually it decreases each reunion and sort of is at its trial at like 20 years where we are, where you're like late 40s. And that's because he said you likely might have teenagers at home who are potentially difficult, aging parents. One other thing he said that really stuck with me was that you're actually have some cognitive decline that starts around I think it peaks at 40, but then it declines. So although your experiential wisdom is going up, your sort of like day-to-day ability to power through and really be sort of that aggressive performer at work declines over time. And so basically they were going through that curve. So sort of in your 50s, early 50s, you start getting happier again, I think, because the kids move out and you get a little freedom. But then it basically splits into two. So some people continue to get happier and some people get a lot less happy. And he was basically saying a lot of high achievers get a lot less happy because of that cognitive decline. You're not performing at the same level of work. So unless you sort of shift what you're doing at that point, you will be unhappy because you basically are still trying to live up to the standard that you once have and still trying to, be that same competitive person at your professional life. So he was saying, embrace basically these changes that are happening and make changes in your life to maybe teach and guide people, mentor, have a different role at work, have a different role at home, have a different role in your life, where you're sort of building on that wisdom and experience instead of sort of just staying stuck on that same track. So it was really interesting, like try to, recognize that and switch to like where you'd probably be more at peace at that stage.
Pam, I wonder if, this was this comment about strivers, right? This is where the striver did not experience as much happiness. And I'm wondering if, actually that was also in line with what Perlo showed on her charts, which was very interesting, where people, if you look at joy, achievement, and there was one more metric, but on the achievement side was kind of the strivers equivalent. And it was really interesting. Achievement meaning titles, network, blah, 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 where professional achievement leads to a sense of happiness. It was interesting to see that people who actually valued, that part of the equation, just like strivers, they thought that they were never adequately recognized, so they actually turned out to be less happier than the other two who focused on joy and purpose.
Yeah, I think it seems to match up.
Yeah, I also agree with you, Pam, that that Brooks presentation was, still stuck with me days later, and the notion of, it seemed like you go from like top ranked player on the field to like offensive coordinator or coach or owner of the team kind of transition, and that if you try and continue to be the fastest running back on the field, in your 40s, like that's going to be tough. And you'll probably not be happy because there's going to be, people who are in our equivalent, like crunching the numbers faster or doing, working 7 days a week and, burning the midnight oil. Whereas I think some of the skills he mentioned for that upper track around like judgment, mentorship, leadership, kind of pattern recognition, those kinds of things. It's like going from entrepreneur to VC, almost like a transition. And so that was, that definitely resonated. And Pam, before we move off to other sessions, given that you're running a family office business, what's your take on the bubble? I'm sure your clients are, curious. Are they out buying lumber and gold, or what's the plan?
Yeah, we always have, we always have a lot of diversification. So we have a lot of real assets in the portfolio. I think this is just such an uncertain time, not just like the bubble, but just, again, I guess we could get into other sessions soon, but just, what impact will tech have on the future with AI and so many changes in different industries. It just feels like we're at an inflection point of, a lot of changes that are going to happen in a lot of different industries and a lot of uncertainty, which just makes people feel uncomfortable, in addition to government debt, which I agree with. It was a scary moment with the debt ceiling, but you just feel like they're just putting Band-Aids on it and they're not really fixing any problems that are really out there. So, we're just seeing so many things crop up. And I think what it makes people feel uncomfortable, where we guide clients is it's not the time to take on a lot of concentrated exposure at this point. I mean, I don't ever feel like you really should have a lot of concentrated exposure. Try to diversify as much as possible because we don't know what's coming. And when you don't know what's coming, we just have to make sure that we're going to be protected in different environments. So, we have a lot of just general market exposure, a lot of different asset classes we try to incorporate, and just making sure that if we're, overexposed in an area, we'd be okay if something went wrong in that particular area, because sometimes you can't avoid those concentrated exposures. Yeah, I have to say, I feel like it's always sort of uncertain. I have to say 20 years, 25 years, whatever I've been in this industry, it always feels uncertain. And now it feels like particularly uncertain for a lot of industries. So I'm sure you guys all feel like this with healthcare, with energy, with like everything is just like seems like you're looking out and you don't know where it's going to be in 5 years.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, it does underscore some of the fundamentals around diversification and not no sudden movements. Don't try and time the market kind of stuff because it seems like that those rules still hold even in 2023.
They
As
really do. I
Buffett
mean, yeah.
says, right? Buffett says, put your money in an index fund, in the S&P 500 index fund.
Really, like the less you look, the like sort of the better you do. When
Yeah.
you start second guessing everything is where things sort of fall apart, because if you even think back the last couple years, I know we don't want to get off track from the reunion, but like who would have thought we would have had like one of the biggest pandemics, then growth in the market directly afterwards, downturn last year. I mean, no one really predicted these moves, and it's very difficult to predict. So that's why you sort of have to, I think the best thing to do is to actually like formulate a plan that you're comfortable with and stick with it.
Yeah.
Not try to like get out of the market and then get back in. And it just really, even if you get it right a couple times, you really just can't make that sustainable.
Did most of us go to the AI session?
Yep.
I love that session. That was so good as well.
Yeah. What
And
were...
so scary.
Well, why don't we start with you, Pam, and then go to David and Rahul? What kind of stuck with you about that session?
Well, first of all, I now have ChatGPT on the phone because it was like, I knew, of course, I've tried it out before, and I've been following AI for a while, but I was sort of fighting it. And now in a way, I think I've like embraced it a little more, that this is here to stay. And like, we're going to have to learn how to incorporate this into our lives and professional lives and personal lives, everything else, because it's just going to probably grow in importance over time. But I think seeing the capabilities in context of like remembering how we were at HBS, reading the cases every day, working with our study groups, on the answers, like trying to think of how you'd answer some questions, all of that like is changed. I don't want to say it goes away, but it's like changed because you can basically, ask your phone to come up, like do all the work for you. So it was a little sad, I have to say. I mean, I've been feeling sad for this next generation who like, I think part of the fun was sort of struggling through it and learning together. I don't know. Is it the same anymore? That's my takeaway. Is like a little bit fascinated, but a little sad and horrified at the same time. That's how I generally feel about AI.
David.
Yeah. I think there are two things that that stuck with me a week later, right? One is the demonstration. So I've used these platforms, but I think watching somebody who is very proficient, what that proficient user, we used to tease, right, in our house that my wife has a PhD in Google search, right? She could get different outcomes than other people because she understood how to interact with it. I do think that is going to be a skill, being able to interact with these platforms. The other thing, though, that I thought was kind of interesting, and he only touched upon it in his talk, is how organizations are different. And so if you think about the classic divisional org chart, an auto company that has different silos and leadership within those silos and the teams, and you're talking about Ant Financial and how few humans they have to manage that many different accounts and that much money. And it is interesting to ask yourself, particularly this sort of .com analogy that we all live through, to say, are people going to try and just bolt this on, which feels like a mistake, but is it going to happen again? Or are they going to incorporate this in a more holistic way across their organization? So I'm thinking a little bit about what does that mean with some of the companies I work with, which is some of them are looking at incredible growth challenges, if I can use that phrase, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investments, Jobs Act, these huge pushes and agenda to try and make new things, versus they've got existing assets that people are trying to retire that still have useful life on them. And so you've got this like winner loser next to each other in the same space. And so there's a lot of, I hate to use the word, but disruption happening. And so, AI is one of those other features that I think just organizationally, how do you get the most out of the teams that you have, and how do those teams look different, and how do they organize themselves?
Yeah, and David, just for the audience, one of the things about that bolt-on kind of observation that they shared was this notion, this analogy of Boston roads and New York City roads. And Boston, basically were these little cow paths that they just poured asphalt over. And then New York is a grid kind of pattern, which is, generally considered much more efficient. And he was saying there are a lot of businesses that are just taking their existing processes and kind of sprinkling AI on top to make it go a little bit faster. And then there are these like fundamentally different approaches that people are taking. And my sense was that like you don't have to transform every company, but the biggest winners will likely be those kind of reinventions. But there are many existing businesses I think will get huge productivity boosts, even if they just put some asphalt on the dirt cow paths. Rahul, what was your takeaway from the AI session?
Yeah, we've been in the AI space for a while, and at one level, I feel like ChatGPT, it's only put, it's a consumer wrapper where
Mm-hmm.
it's made AI understandable and accessible to the average person. But ChatGPT, even ChatGPT and these large language models, they're predictive. They're next word predictive models, right? So you build weights which then predict the next word. Anytime you give a prompt, it gives there's a weightage which generates the next word, or next image or whatever it is. So from that perspective, I think there's a lot of promise. Will it be disruptive? I'm actually, yeah, I'm a little bit concerned because yes, a lot of jobs are going to be affected. But in these times, I think also what Kareem Lakhani was saying. I kind of liked one of the directions, or at least my takeaway was do more that others do less of, right? So what is it going to be that others will be doing less of? So it's things like social connections, it's things like creative stuff. So Airbnb, I feel like the models like Airbnb and Uber, which if you would have looked at a large language model to come up with a, say, give me a new business idea or a business model in the world of transportation, it would not have come up with Uber, right? Why? Because all the training data set which is out in the internet would have said that I'm not going to get into a car with an unknown person. I'm not going to rent, take my people, get unknown people into my car, blah blah blah. So the potential probability of a large language model coming up with a Uber type business model or an Airbnb type business model is difficult. So I think you want to do more that people will do less of, which is these disruptive, groundbreaking, different thought processes. You want to focus on creativity. You want to focus on social aspects because those relationships and connections are still going to matter. And I feel, I think my takeaway also was there is still a huge opportunity because large language models can help inform certain strategic choices. It can do choice development. But at the end of the day, transformation is going to require people because people are still incredibly good at understanding hierarchies. They are very good at understanding power structures. They are very good at understanding politics. They are very good at understanding how to rally people and how not to. Large language models can't do that, right? So they can inform and give strategic insight on the options and the optionality and the probability of success on each one. But the large transformations are still going to require a substantial human component, which is why I feel the social parts, the creative parts, all those are still going to be really important going forward.
Yeah, just for people who are listening to this who obviously weren't able to attend the Lakhani lecture, the examples that he used that Pam was alluding to and Rahul was alluding to are he took a HBS case study, and for many business schools like we know those well, and you read 10, 15 pages of this and exhibits, and then you kind of go to class the next day and you have to discuss it. And he basically had ChatGPT, which, as Rahul knows, is a Bard competitor, a Google Bard competitor. um, and he said, hey, analyze this case. Like, what are the key takeaways from like a strategy point of view? And then it produced like a very kind of compelling summary. And then he said, okay, but now take it from a finance kind of, quant jock point of view. And then they gave a whole bunch of other stuff. And it was pretty remarkable how quickly it was able to do that. And the answer seemed like pretty compelling. And I think, Pam was alluding to like, wow, it used to take us, at least an hour to discuss and come up with that. And maybe if your study group was good, you could do it a little faster. But that was kind of jarring, I think, to see it used in real time versus like, oh, I'll just go to ChatGPT and ask it to write a poem. Like you kind of go through this cycles of like, oh, it's a curiosity, and then it's like kind of like a fun little parlor trick. But then when you see practitioners, really put it through its paces, like what David was also alluding to, like you start to see the potential being way more than like, oh, write me a poem in the voice of Shakespeare about, Palo Alto. Like it does way more than that.
So Tom, I was at my daughter, my older daughter, my 15-year-old's, her high school. They invited me over to watch their hackathon. So they did a 24-hour hackathon. They signed up the Ocean Conservatory to decrease, and their problem statement was decreasing plastic pollution in oceans, right? In 24 hours, this 4-person high school team, 2 9th graders, 1 10th grader, 1 11th grader, they used a ChatGPT plugin to feed 100 research articles and identify what were the top enzymes that would work to degrade bioplastics. Then one of the, and then these guys, and I asked them, I said, what was the prompt? So they go, well, these articles are written, these are like Nature articles, ACS articles, like the Academy of Chemical Society, the American Chemical Society. These are highly technical 100-page articles. Right? And I said, how did you guys even understand these articles? They were like, oh, all we said was give us the top 3 outcomes that a 14-year-old would understand. Boom, right? And they fed 100, they found 2 enzymes. Then one of these guys, he used CRISPR. I mean, unbelievable. My wife and I, we are like looking at each other. We're like, what the hell is going on, right? And they used CRISPR to genetically edit the enzyme because they used open source models, and they built a Python model to determine that in salt water, the enzyme would not be stable and the temperature would degrade the enzyme. So they bioengineered that enzyme. This was not hypothetical. Then they used a open source model from Princeton and another from Columbia to determine if it would actually stay stable. So they validated their genetic edited enzyme, and then they rapid prototype. I mean, they did a MakerBot. They actually rapid prototype a functional model with this thing would float in the water. It had a fan in there. It had a receptacle for the enzyme. It had solar panels, blah, 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 because it would be power. They did all this in 24 hours. I would have put these kids in front of a bunch of PhDs who do this kind of stuff at, various companies. I mean, I talked to some of these guys. I was flabbergasted as to how these tools, which we are still struggling to even understand. These kids have literally absorbed, and to your point, Tom, exponential. I mean, these guys are, I think the compression that's happened in product development, we compress any product, whether it's a poem, whether it's a book, whether it's something like enzymes to biodegrade plastics. At one level, it's almost scary to have seen it in person, but I think it also holds a lot of promise in this world of exponential change.
Yeah, I think one other thing was interesting, which was, I don't know if you remember how the whole session started, where they showed the video.
Oh, yes.
Of like maybe 20 years ago, what they were projecting out over time. Like they're like, oh, you might have your telephone where you might be able to do a video call with people when you're on the beach somewhere and you're, in your flip-flops. And they were showing all these videos, and then they showed which company was actually putting these videos on, which was AT&T, which we know hasn't been like the most innovative company out there. So I think what's interesting about this also is that we're just at the starting point And like, we're trying to envision where it's going, and we might envision some things like in reality, but a lot of things will be a lot different than we expect them to be. So it sort of just reminds you, like, it's hard to look out and say, this is where this is going to go. It's like really hard from our standpoint to see. And like some things they got right, and some things they didn't, but they got a lot right, but they got like the whole company wrong that would be leading the charge.
Yeah, totally. And Rahul, I know you've got to drop,
I gotta
but I
drop.
wanted to thank you
Yeah.
for joining. And David and Pam, do you have a few minutes to keep
Thanks,
going?
guys.
Or?
Yeah, I have a few more minutes.
Yeah.
All right. So I found one of the commercials that the AT&T, and this is like, I think,
It was cool. It was so
Yeah.
interesting. I know. I loved seeing it. I was like, what? Okay, that's
Have you
it.
ever borrowed a book from thousands of miles away? Across the country? Without stopping for directions? Or sent someone a fax? From the beach? You will. And the company that'll bring it to you, AT&T.
I love it.
Have you ever paid a toll without slowing down? Bought
this is
concert
from like
tickets
1992, I think. It's
from
crazy.
cash machines? You will. And the company that'll bring it to you, AT&T.
So there's a lot of examples of this, but basically they were pretty good at predicting where tech was going. This was like in 1992. And to your point, Pam, it just wasn't AT&T that benefited from it. Was, the Ubers, the eBays, the, Stripes, the Facebooks or whatever. I wonder, one thing that we should talk about before we run out of time, that I think is near and dear to a lot of our hearts, is parenting and education of the next generation. And I'm curious how you all are thinking about your kids, like preparing, the next generation for the future. Like as an example, my oldest, who's just finished his first year in high school, like he's pretty into computer science, and he's like, yeah, so I think I want to go into computer science. I was like, 2 years ago it would have been a no-brainer. Now, like, English is probably the number one programming language. And so, like, are we really going to need junior software engineers at tech companies the way that we used to? Or will that code be written by large models? I'm curious how you all think about preparing, the next gen.
Oh my gosh, $1 million question.
Yeah, we struggle with this daily, and we're now blessed. We have one who has landed his first job on his own without help from his parents.
Congrats.
We're happy. But I think the things that we try to teach, and that I think is still not common, is that people be able to take ownership, take initiative, communicate. Right. And trying to think about the other people in their sphere, right? They're not only their bosses, but their peers and others, and trying to think beyond whatever task they're given. I think those are harder, but I believe a lot of those skills, I don't know about writing an individual line of script necessarily, but I think understanding computers and how they're working and understanding these features and how they're working are going to be differentiating aspects, right? And so I think we try to, much like Rahul was saying, teaching your kids to focus on the creative and on the social aspects and those things that machines can't yet do, but also trying to help them understand what is it going to be that differentiates somebody who's doing a really good job and is a truly valued member of a team versus somebody who's just able to do a task, right? So don't just learn the hard skills, but think about those. Think about what it means to other people around you for you to be able to be reliable. Think about what it means for you to be somebody who will tell them if something isn't working and if you need help. Because I think those are features that when I work with my own teams, I notice is a difference maker.
What do you think, Pam?
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. It's so hard to look out and say how things are going to shake out with all the changes that are likely coming. But I do think the ability to communicate, lead, shine light, share, all those things are going to be harder to go away, I think. Um, even then I think of like the wealth management, family office business. I think a lot of things are getting commoditized in the investment space and even legal work and tax work. I can see the tools, I can see what's coming. But in the end of the day, the guidance, the advice, the trust, there's still that there, right? Someone connecting the dots, someone helping you, guide you on important decisions, whatever industry you're in, leading company, leading people. I feel like that's last to go in the end. Maybe we'll go like full circle, what are the core things that make us human will be last to go.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of when we were talking about the bubble and the fundamentals still being important. And I kind of feel like the fundamentals of education in terms of critical thinking, analytical thinking, the ability to learn, to synthesize information, to
Share,
communicate,
communicate. Yeah, exactly.
to collaborate, to lead, to be led, to, all that kind of stuff. Like, I think that will maybe even be more important because a lot of the hard number crunching, like, grunt work that we used to do maybe in our first analyst job out of undergrad, like that kind of stuff. Yeah, that could be easily automated. I mean, I remember one of my first jobs I had to go through. I worked at a litigation consulting firm. Had to go through discovery, like read, like rooms and rooms of boxes of documents. And you're like, that clearly can be summarized by just some basic OCR on, and then you dump it into a large language model and get a summary or even, search through, or building spreadsheet models, like basic financial models. Like I could see that being done pretty quickly. But the core kind of many of those like liberal arts things that have been valued for centuries, I do agree that those I think will always be valuable and highly sought after. However, I also think it is important to know how the fundamentals in the technical work actually happen. So as an example, like when we use calculators, like if we never learned adding and subtracting and dividing and basic,
Right.
Arithmetic, I think it would have felt a little like you wouldn't be able to discern the output from the calculator or the spreadsheet as easily as, as well. So I think the fundamentals will matter, but it's definitely uncharted territory.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts from both of you on what you see in hiring, maybe working with people earlier in their career. I'll start with a quick story. Been very fortunate to work with super capable people. I have noticed that the difference between the outstanding folks that you hire and the great ones, like everybody is generally hired because they're smart and they can think on their feet and all that kind of thing. But the ones that move furthest ahead are the ones that can bring disparate groups together and get alignment on hard, complex topics where there's imperfect information. And being right is like necessary but not sufficient. And for whatever reason, you definitely see variations in the ability to do that. But yeah, let's hear what you all are seeing, from a manager's point of view with like kind of younger folks joining the workforce.
Yeah, sure. I can start. I just hired 2 new people, and I have to say their tech skills are fantastic. Like their ability to grasp tech tools is just, it's like a different language they've learned that I, like
Yeah, they
in
grew up with
now
it.
in
Yeah.
my later, back end of the career, I feel like, wow, I mean, fortunately, we're sort of like the generation that was straddling both, like pre-tech, post-tech a little bit. And I see it with my kids too. Like they just get it so quickly. It's like bred in them, so they can just embrace these new tech tools, which is so incredibly helpful, right? For us who are trying to keep up with all the innovation and lead, tech forward modern companies. I do think, back to what you were saying, and what I worry about for this next generation a little bit is like, are they going to, what's missing from not having spent those grueling nights, reviewing those docs, and what did you gain? I mean, I think there's some kind of like resilience and work ethic and like general understanding of like how the calculator works when you're the one who like built the models and did the research and put the PowerPoint deck together from like the very first building block that might be missed. And so, what kind of skills are they going to need to be able to be successful, to build on if they are missing some of those early on tools? And maybe it's like what you said, it's like, you need to see the ability to lead, the ability to collaborate, the ability to like think through, like, what does this data mean and how can I apply it, and all that. So I do think there's going to be like a new, sort of emerging set of skills maybe that these folks will need to be successful in this new world that we're entering. I'm interested to see how it all plays out, but I do think it's not like the same. They're not getting the same exact experiences that we all had for so long.
David, any thoughts from you on working with early career folks and kinds of skills that you're going to look for?
I think I'll connect it back to one of the other panels that I went to, which was a professor, Abdullah, I think. He was talking about populism, and it was framed around the Ukraine war, although it wasn't, from my perspective, wasn't really about the Ukraine war, but it was about this sort of populist backlash, because I think there's beginning to be this interesting widening of a divide among people who are proficient with these tools and who are gaining these skills and who are thinking about how they're going to make their way in the new world, versus a lot of folks that are getting left behind, both older workers who haven't learned some of these same skills, or younger workers who haven't found their way into a job yet. And he was talking a lot about it being critical from a political landscape perspective, that populism is back on the rise and that globalization is not popular at the moment. And he was drawing analogies to 1913, when the world had a high degree of globalization. We obviously saw that retrench back to nationalism following the wars. So I think about this with younger folks, and I say the more they've spent their time specializing, I feel like right now when you have a child applying to college, they almost have to pick their major before they get in. And they're learning a set of skills that require a level of sophistication, but they are missing something about those common bonds with other people. I mean, the fact that I watch the same cartoons and daytime television as one of my peers, I was able to relate to a lot of people. And because I had to do those physical calculations, and I expected that I was going to have to do the same work everybody else did, there's an ability to connect, I think, with people and think about from their perspective that I worry some of the young folks that I work with who are brilliant don't have that. They're kind of almost too specialized in a way. And so being able to think about how am I going to change work done in the field by a large, diverse population of folks, they almost can't, in some cases, translate into what that means, because they haven't had that lived experience, but they also are missing some of those same connective, shared experiences as from their youth, because they were so different from such an early age.
That reminds me of another panel I went to, which was about college admissions.
Oh, I
and
avoided that one because I was worried. I knew it would give me anxiety.
yeah,
Any
so
big takeaways? Just specialize, right? They need to be so
yeah.
specialized.
So one thing is like everyone needs to recalibrate when we were applying to college versus like this next generation. Like the rule book is totally different and the statistics are different because of two things, like the Common App, but also test optional. It just has vastly increased the number of applicants, where in the past, when we were in high school, you would self-select out. Like if you didn't have a certain SAT score, like you just wouldn't apply to certain schools. You'd be like, well, I'm not going to waste my time for that. But now you really can. They talked about how like so many schools now have straight A students. Like straight A's is not as hard as maybe it was in the past due to grade inflation. So that was one takeaway, which was like, hey, don't expect your kids, if they work hard and have great report card and they're in a few clubs and they do a sport and they write great essays and they interview, like that doesn't guarantee you to get into like a well-known school. So that was I kind of appreciated that, to kind of like be more realistic. And then the second thing, which was sad, was the specialization thing. And the quote from the consultant who works, who knows a lot of these like deans of admissions and everything, was that the notion of a well-rounded student is not at all interesting from a college admissions point of view, because they are trying to assemble a class and they want a lot of people that spike in different areas. So the notion of like, oh, well, what about the student that's into robotics but also likes to read literature, does some community service, is like, well, if he's into robotics, hopefully he won like national top team and competed like, in, with some NASA program or something, right? Like it has to be, or if he plays the piano, like, well, did he do a recital at like, a major kind of at the White House or whatever? And so there was this notion of this pejorative term called standard strong, which is like, yes, great grades, well-rounded, great test scores, like whatever, versus like, oh, this is like the Olympic gymnast, or this is like the country's top goalie,
The strong edges, they described it. I once heard like everyone's sort of an outlier, which I think makes a well-rounded class, but it makes me sad in some ways, because when I think of our HBS class, yes, we had some outliers, but like what made us cohesive, I think, is what David said, is like each of us individually I felt very well-rounded and a good communicator, a good leader, a knowledgeable about a lot of things in life, curiosity about lots of topics, that made us bigger thinkers than smaller specialized thinkers. And we each individually, and now I see it, like it's so important to have this like experiential, I am back to that panel, experiential knowledge when you're guiding people, leading organizations, like ability to connect dots on a lot of topics, trust, confidence in a lot of different areas, that I worry that like these schools are missing the point in a lot of areas. Like, how are we going to build the leaders tomorrow if you get someone who's such an outlier that only knows that you're really only looking for like a specialty in one little thing? I mean, maybe that's where the world's going, but that to me doesn't seem like really the recipe for a lifelong successful career or, professionally, personally. I think like, there's something missing to that philosophy. I don't know about you guys, but I always felt like there was something really special with our class, because that everyone on their own was such a connector of dots, like had so many areas of, where their brain lit up, not just one.
David, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just reflecting. I feel like there's this themes of what is going to make people happy, not only at one point in their life, but across their life that Pam was talking about earlier. And to me, that's very much related to this theme of the populism discussion, which was about human dignity, right? What gives people importance and self-worth is around being able to do something that you feel is actually valued and important. And when I think about that dot connecting person that Pam was just describing, to me, it's about being able to have your own place within the world, which requires you to understand something beyond that one specific specialty. So I hope that we will see kids grow and evolve outside of that one thing they had to declare a major in back when they were 17, and they didn't really know what they wanted to do with their life yet. That they'll have the chance to kind of grow and evolve, because I think that's something that's been really important. And I think when I listen to you guys talking about innovation and changes around this technology, I realize that whatever people think they're going to start out doing, they're going to do something different.
Exactly.
So that fluid ability to change, ability to readjust, redefine yourself in the broader context, I think is going to be very important for
And
people.
evolve in our world that's constantly changing, right? If we have people with this deep expertise who wrote these papers about this topic, and then all of a sudden that's not really a needed thing anymore. Again, I just feel like it's unfortunate that we're looking so micro when we maybe should be looking a little more macro right now. People who can think big picture.
Yeah, especially because there's so much uncertainty. That I remember when we were coming up, there was this notion of the T-shaped skill set, and you wanted to have like some breadth, and then there was one area that you went a little deeper, and I feel like they've shrunk the T, so it's just like
It's like an
super
I.
deep, right?
It's like an L.
Yeah,
Like a line.
That's right. It's just like an I. Yeah, and I worry a little bit because those people that they were like, well, these are just well-rounded, great kids, like they're standard strong. Those are the people I'd love to hire because I can put them on
that's
any
the
project.
thing.
Yeah.
And like things are changing, right? That like, are we going to say to this, even with sports? I mean, I don't want to go on a tangent, but like, we don't even let our kids experience so many sports because you have to decide at age 6, like what you're going to. It's so crazy. I mean, we've basically said in a world that's evolving so quickly that you need to specialize so soon. It almost seems opposite. We should say broaden out.
Yeah.
Be able to think of your world and all the ways you could go and adjust and be nimble, then get so deep so quickly that you might not be able to change when we need to. And as a society, we need people who can help us think through these important, hard concepts.
Yeah. And then I think one of the last things so we'll go into parting thoughts and advice for the audience. But one last point about this topic, the speaker at the college admissions thing, she was saying, you can see why they do this by how they brag about each entering class. And they say, well, we had 3 people with a published article in science, whatever, the National Journal of Medicine or whatever, and we had 2 people who were, on the Junior Olympics team. And we have 1 person who, discovered, this new enzyme in the ocean and is now like,
Exactly.
has started 3 companies. And there's this weird perverse incentive where like they get rewarded, the admissions team gets rewarded for assembling this all-star class, which then drives more donations, more applications. The more applications, they lower their acceptance rate. The lowest acceptance rate you can get is like the vanity metric. And it's just like you end up with this class of like super spiky individuals, but agree, like I'm not sure those are the best from the employer's point of view, but that's the system.
We'll see how it shakes out. Again, education is probably going to change as well, so we'll see how things shake out.
One of the leaders at the school where we send our kids has this phrase. He calls it eggs to eagles. And so those admissions directors are trying to identify that individual who's going to spark later in life, and they're looking for that because it gives them this halo, right? I think our job, turning to your kind of parting thought question, Tom. I think our job as parents, or I think our job as members of the broader global community, is to try and figure out what do we do not only in identifying that set of amazing talent, but what do we do with everybody else who's also amazing to try and help them bring their best to each situation. So how do you make every person 10% better? What do you do to inspire and engage them? And I think that starts with, if you've got kids at home, thinking about your children and figuring out how you actually, what investments can you make? What exposures can you give them? They're going to help them show up the best that they can for those things that they choose to be a part of. And it's not easy. I certainly haven't figured that out, but that to me is the goal. And if you're doing that, you're doing something right.
Thanks, David. Pam, any parting thoughts or reflections on your part?
Yeah, I think going back to the reunion just reminded me that we're all on this path. And it's never really like you get to the end. It's really nice to get the little shake every 5 years or so to just have you reflect and say, am I on the right? Do I feel like I'm on the right path? Do I feel like I can make changes to benefit myself or others around me? And I love that HBS has been like a partner on our path. I didn't realize when I signed up that it was going to be, beyond those couple years. I thought it was like a, great education for 2 years. But what I think has really been meaningful is like the partnership, not just to be a better professional, but like a better person in the end.
Totally agree. Yeah. My parting thoughts are, one, I had this conversation with a fellow alum who was in their 50th year reunion, and he was totally on his game and talking about like the work he had done both in industry and actually served in the military as well. And I was so inspired, like, wow, we think we're far along. We're 20 years out, but there's still so much more to do, especially with the advances in healthcare and kind of, longevity. You could clearly run for president, when you're 80 kind of thing. So I don't know if it makes you the best president, but, you can definitely run. And so that's awesome. And then one last thing, in terms of advice for folks who are earlier in their career, I would say just stay curious and always be learning, because to Pam's earlier point, like there's always uncertainty. Right now it's AI. Before that, was Web3. Before that was like mobile or social, the internet, whatever, like globalization. Like there's always some new huge change, and the ability to kind of be really intellectually curious and learn how to learn and love it. Just I feel like it has served all of us for a long time and will continue to. So, with that, I'm going to thank you, David and Pam, for joining, and Rahul for helping us kick off this conversation, and wish you all a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks, Tom. So good to see you. Bye, David.
Likewise.
Bye, Pam.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.